and then we'll get going.
Excellent. Great. Emily, do you mind sharing your slides?
I'm working on it if you want to go ahead and.
Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining Sustain SC today on this really informative webinar that we've prepared for you with Lucas Clay from the Clemson Experimental Forest from Clemson University on the introduction to carbon markets. We are so grateful that you've made time to do this. We've got an action-packed hour for you. So if we look at the next slide, just to run through our agenda for the next hour, we just want to hit on where this webinar really fits in the overall framework for Sustain SC. And then I'll turn it over to Lucas, who has really been drilling down and working on this presentation to give you a level set experience of the introduction to carbon markets. And then we'll take the last 5 minutes of the hour to wrap up, share with you some upcoming events with Sustain SC. And we truly thank you for being part of this webinar today. In regard to how our webinars work at Sustain SC, we do keep the participants muted throughout the session, really more so to not have any background noise or distractions for the audience. And for this particular webinar, we are going to have a couple of moments throughout Lucas's presentation to address questions and answers. So please feel welcome to put your questions in the chat as they come up in your mind. And then when we stop at the different sections of the program, we will field those questions. And then at the end, if there's other questions that come up that have arisen throughout the time, we'll address those at the very end as well. So to kick us off, we are all here for Sustain SC efforts to connect the sustainability goals of businesses in South Carolina with local solutions that benefit our economy, our environment, and our people. And that is the bread and butter, the mission of Sustain SC. We really are working to make South Carolina a more sustainable state. And we're doing that through the roadmap, where we're focused on 7 accelerators that really are the framework in how we do our business with all our membership and partners and stakeholders throughout the state. So today we're focused on one of the accelerators that we're working daily on called resilience and conservation. And we have priorities and strategic actions that we work on within this accelerator. We really are planning for a more resilient South Carolina. And as part of that, we recognize that carbon markets are a part of becoming more resilient. So today's webinar is really getting into a level set of information to see, as we think about our strategic actions, of how do we become more resilient and figure out land and water conservation and become more sustainable businesses in the state. How can these carbon markets play into that effort? So that brings us to our speaker today, Lucas Clay, who is a research ecologist with the Clemson University Experimental Forest through Clemson University. Lucas's research focuses on using different tools to measure ecosystem services to drive climate solutions and financing in southern forests. He recently completed his PhD in forest resources at Clemson, and he's working on climate financing by integrating innovative measurements with tools to quantify carbon sequestration and ecosystem services. So, on that note, I know Lucas has been an incredible resource throughout South Carolina and to many partners in conservation to figure out where carbon markets fit, especially in forest carbon. So, on that note, I will turn it over to you, Lucas, and thank you so much for giving your time and talent to all of us today so we can grow a little smarter when it comes to this topic.
So thanks so much, Kristen, and thanks so much for having me today. And as you all just heard, my name is Lucas Clay, and I work at Clemson University, focused on nature-based solutions and carbon markets. So today I'm going to give a talk regarding those things, a little bit of an overview of carbon markets and how they can potentially be beneficial for both landowners and for businesses here in South Carolina. So in terms of the presentation today, we're going to look at three different categories. We're going to start by looking at the overview of carbon markets, the structure, the pricing, some trends in the markets over the recent years. We're going to talk about the principles of carbon markets and what drives the foundation for integrity within these markets, and then also look at the processes for how project development work and how carbon credit purchasing works as well. So we're going to start with that structure and pricing. So in recent years, we're actually starting to value carbon. And to value carbon really drives to home this idea that we now have a market for it. So there's supply and demand. So the demand side is those corporations and airlines who are required or want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in various voluntary frameworks or compliance markets. The supply is those landowners or farmers who actually need incentives to draw down greenhouse gas emissions or remove carbon from the atmosphere. So the carbon market provides a framework to do just that. It provides a way to value these emissions and reductions in carbon sequestration across forest lands. And it's also a mechanism to sell and trade credits to buyers. So an offset credit or a carbon credit is a credit for greenhouse gas reductions that are achieved by an activity outside cap sectors, so outside industry credits. So to put that in easier terms, really we're looking at 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalents or carbon dioxide equivalents. So this is when 1 carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere, or when it is its conversion or emission to the atmosphere is reduced. Now, there's so many different types of carbon credits that we can be looking at. There's forestry, land use credits, there's agriculture credits, there's chemical industry credits, energy efficiency credits. All of these different credits are doing the same type of thing. They are a mechanism or a framework to actually remove emissions or carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in a certain way. Today, we're going to focus mostly just on the forestry credits and how they work and how they can be applicable in South Carolina. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there are different types of carbon trading mechanisms. The two main ones are compliance markets, which have regulations, and then the voluntary market, which essentially is voluntary in nature. And we'll talk about that after compliance. But the compliance market is requiring regulated entities to trade emission allowances or purchase offset credits. So this is typically governed by states or subnational entities. And this is where the supply and demand comes into play. Credits are typically sold for the lowest possible price due to supply and demand regulatory obligations. And the best example of this in in the United States is the California cap and trade market. So cap and trade works in a way where you have both allowances or the ability to pollute, or offsets where you're actually purchasing these carbon credits or offset credits to offset emissions. So in this example, we have 2 emitters. We have emitter A and emitter B, and they're both governed under the California cap and trade market. Their emissions are capped at the red dotted line through the middle of this image. But emitter A is actually emitting more emissions than that dotted line, and emitter B is emitting less emissions. So emitter A is going to need to purchase either allowances or offset credits to offset their excess GHG emissions, whereas emitter B can actually sell allowances to emitter A. So in this case, emitter A is probably going to purchase a combination of allowances or ability to pollute and offset credits so that they can meet their regulatory requirements within the cap and trade. And then over time, this cap is going to decrease as to reduce total emissions in the atmosphere. So in the California compliance market, when we look specifically at offset credits, we're looking at two different types of credits, the DEBs and non-DEBs. So DEBs are direct environmental benefits. The easiest way to look at this are these are credits where they are produced in California. So these are forestry projects that are in California. They have a higher price premium because of the regulatory requirements surrounding them. So they're around $28.25 a ton, whereas projects outside of California are averaging about $14 a ton. So, or this is also reflected in the market value. So there's about $0.5 billion in the DEBs credit trading, and then $2 billion for non-DEBs. And again, this is because California companies are required to purchase a certain portion of DEBs, but there's also other entities, as you can see below, Quebec, Washington, Nova Scotia, that can purchase non-DEBs that are not required to purchase the DEB credits. So this program started in 2012. The DEBS specification started in 2020, and this is currently legislated through the California Air Resources Board through 2030, but the extension in this process is currently ongoing. So there's about 175 entities that are retiring credits, so they're purchasing these carbon credits, and then about 240 project developers. So that's just one example of a compliance market in the United States and Canada. But around the world, there's about 75 different compliance markets and/or emission trading systems that are enacted. So the European ETS emission trading system is one of the largest and most robust programs for allowances, though it does not involve carbon credits. Trading allowances around $90 a ton. The Chinese market is up and coming since 2021. And then we also see a variety of other types of markets and carbon taxes implemented around the world. So moving on to the voluntary market. The voluntary market is a similar concept, but really in this case, buyers or purchasers are purchasing these credits voluntarily to achieve net zero goals or contribute to their ESG or corporate social responsibility objectives. So this again is voluntary in nature, and it's outside of any government regulation or purview. So these carbon registries, these are independent organizations, certify these offset credits based on methodologies. And then because of this, these credit prices can vary based on a variety of different factors. So in the voluntary market, we have, instead of it being supply and demand, we see these trends in voluntary carbon pricing due to a variety of different factors, including avoided credits versus removals, the co-benefits, nature versus technology credits, vintage, and then location and proximity to buyers. And we'll go into what some of those mean as time goes on here. But what we can see in terms of a trend overall is we do see an increase in carbon credit pricing over the last couple of years. So we have three different project types here, as you can see, improved forest management, afforestation, and REDD+ or avoided conversion credits. But overall, we see this increase in the dotted yellow line from around $5 a ton in 2021 to up to about $11 a ton. And what we see is this increase in the desire for what we call high quality credits. And the definition of high quality is emerging, but what the market is looking for is removal of carbon from the atmosphere, opposed to avoided credits, which you see in the top one there, and then also co-benefits. So the co-benefits would be other ecosystem services like water quality, wildlife, biodiversity that forest credits can contribute to. And then there's also an increase in the desire for nature credits in this sense, because there is that co-benefit component. And then vintage, so newer credits, and then location and proximity to buyers is also beginning to be important in these types of credits. So buyers purchasing credits, especially forestry credits that are near where their business operations are taking place. So a little bit overview of the state of the voluntary carbon market in terms of total value and total volume. On the top, you can see the total value of traded credits for the last couple, or since the evolution of the market pre-2005 to 2022. This is some of our most recent data. And we can see that in 2021, it topped out at about $2.1 billion in traded value. Now, what's interesting is this traded about 516 million tons of carbon. You can see there in the blue bar graph. But then we move into 2022, and what we see is just a slight decline in the traded value at 1.9 billion, but we see a pretty significant decline in the volume of credits traded here. So what this is really showing us is that there is an increase in the price point around these credits, which is good for everyone. This is going to help increase the ability to start projects as credits and carbon becomes more valuable, and also increase the integrity of these projects as well. So carbon markets have the ability to enhance ecosystem services in South Carolina and elsewhere, as being a mechanism for conservation and maximizing carbon drawdown. So they're one other new type of market-based solution for conservation management. They provide frameworks for easements, improving forest management, avoiding conversion to other land uses, and also building in climate change resilience into our forests. And forest conservation for carbon credits also creates, again, like I mentioned before, these co-benefits. So wildlife, soil retention, increased water quality, and biodiversity. So more of a focus on these co-benefits and not as much on timber potentially. They also help maximize carbon drawdown. So this is voluntary markets are being linked to these landowners. So being able to implement and channel capital into local landowners that are contributing to natural climate solutions. So before we move on, I'll just see if there's any other questions, Kristen, before we move into the principles of carbon markets.
Great, thank you, Lucas. Currently, there are no questions in the chat. If anyone has any questions at this point in the presentation, feel welcome to put them in the chat. We'll wait a couple of minutes and okay, seeing no typing and seeing no questions, I think we're good to keep moving, Lucas. Thank you.
Sounds good. So the next step is the principles behind the carbon offset projects. And these principles are really what govern how these projects sequester additional carbon in the environment. And then they also show how these projects have integrity. So there's been a real push to make sure that these projects have high quality, high integrity, which means they're sequestering the carbon that they say they do. So those principles are going to be real, additional, permanent, and verifiable carbon credits. So the first tenet is real. This is essentially making sure that the carbon is there and that we're measuring this carbon in a scientifically robust way. So this is taking in-field measurements or in-forest measurements to make sure that we're measuring the carbon in a statistically significant way. And then we're also being conservative with how we do it. So we're looking at measuring the DBH and the height of various trees, and then extrapolating that carbon across the forest. The second piece of that puzzle is additionality and baseline. So once we know how much carbon is in the forest, we have to be able to compare how much carbon is actually sequestered that's additional or going to be due to the project and carbon that was already there or going to happen before. So the definition of additionality is this idea that the new activity or the carbon project implemented in the project area must be different than business as usual, and that payments for the carbon credits must provide the financial incentive to the landowner to implement new management. So this is the idea that, again, that when you start a carbon project, we're going to be doing something different on the land than prior to the carbon project. And the baseline is the point from where the additional carbon sequestered on the landowner's property can be sold as carbon credits. So that's that definitive point in time where we are changing. But then we need to use some data and some other information to be able to determine what would that baseline be, or what would have happened on the property if we had never implemented that carbon project. So we do that with a couple of different tools. We look at common practice values for the region, looking at forest inventory data. So metric tons of carbon per acre. We have some of that data from the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program through the U.S. Forest Service. We also use management plans, future management goals of landowners, land encumbrances, and also land appraisals to be able to determine what that baseline will be for that carbon project. So here's an example of how this additionality or how this project change would look. So on the y-axis, we have carbon sequestration. On the x-axis of the graph, we have time. And in this case, this gray line represents maximizing timber net present value, or would be our baseline in a southern pine forest. So we're gonna, if you look from the left here, we're gonna grow our trees out. There's gonna be increasing carbon sequestration. And then at some point, you're gonna harvest a lot of these trees, and then you'll replant and continue to harvest. So this is pretty standard practice in Loblolly Pine Forest here in the Southeast. If we're gonna change something in terms of having a new project management, we might do something like this with the green line. And the green line shows us that, right there where we would have harvested, we may actually extend this rotation a little bit more, and then we might not harvest as much. So we can see there's an extension of the rotation here, and then a decline in harvesting. And what that does is actually leaves more carbon on the landscape for longer, and then we're actually going to keep a lot of those trees, which is what we might call additional carbon. So when it comes to actually selling carbon credits, we're only selling the carbon that's the net change between the green line and the gray line in this graph. So that's where we get our additionality because we changed that practice. The third major tenet is permanence. Permanence is this idea that we want to retain the carbon on the landscape forever. We want to keep it out of the atmosphere. So the protocols for implementing these carbon projects typically do this by having long project time frames. So this is projects that last between 40 and 100 plus years. And then easements may be an option to increase the durability. So this is another layer of keeping the land use as forestry, for example. The other piece of permanence is buffer pools. So buffer pools are created to account for unavoidable reversals. Unavoidable reversals are defined as things like fire and severe weather or wind. Avoidable reversals can also play into this. So if another carbon project does illegal harvesting, for example, there might be need to pull from a buffer pool. So in this case, it's very much like an insurance protocol. You're removing about 2 to 29% of the verified carbon credits from the property, and then they're not being sold, they're being held in this buffer pool in case they're ever needed in the future. The next tenet is measurement and verification. So this is, again, goes along with the credits being real, but then having a third party measure what was actually happening out in the forest every 5 to 6 years. So after the project developer comes through, measures the trees, and says we have this many carbon credits, then a third party is going to make sure that that carbon exists, that the credits are calculated correctly, and then the credits would be available for sale. So a couple tenets of improved forest management in South Carolina. So improved forest management is one of the project types where we're taking maybe a lower productivity stand and we're changing that management, as I showed in that example before, to increase carbon sequestration with new types of management. So a couple important tenets is that the land must be viable for commercial harvest. And then it also requires enrollment in various certification programs like the Forest Stewardship Council, Sustainable Forestry Initiative, or the American Tree Farm System. So the goal of the new management is going to increase native plant species and increase the distribution of forest age classes. So we can do this a variety of ways. Potentially it might be avoiding conversion in some project types, increasing the rotation ages, as we showed in that last example, thinning diseased and suppressed trees, managing for brush, increasing stocking, and then also maintaining other stocks at high levels. The other project type is called avoided conversion. So avoided conversion is this idea that we're paying landowners for the carbon credits retained on their land because of imminent conversion. So an example here might be, let's say a landowner was approached by a Walmart or an apartment complex to purchase their land and to build that complex on their land. In this case, they have the imminent conversion shown. They have the idea that they are going to have that land converted from forestry into a different type of land use. So because of this, this project type allows that land to consider their business as usual as zero carbon, because they're going to be removing all of the carbon from that landscape. So in this case, because business as usual is set at zero, the project would allow that landowner could be paid for all of the carbon on their property at that time of the potential conversion. And then the project requires them to continue sustainable forest management going forward through the lifetime of the project. And then the other project type is called afforestation. And this is the idea that we're planting trees on land that has been clear of trees for more than 10 years. So if it's a degraded land or it's some other land use type, we're now going to put trees back on that land. And then the baseline in this scenario is also zero. So all managed above ground carbon counts as additional carbon removals and can be sold as such. And then harvesting typically can't take place for about 30 years after the project start date. So I've talked about these different protocols. We have improved forest management, avoided conversion, and afforestation and reforestation. And then the way these are governed, especially in the voluntary market, is that there are carbon offset registries, and they are producing protocols that define how these carbon credits can be issued. So they have various methodologies and protocols for each of these project types, and they provide the guidance for the management of additionality, how they develop baselines, and they're ultimately the ones that verify and issue these offset credits. And they are typically independent nonprofit organizations. So some examples, as you can see here on the right, are Verra, ACR, Climate Action Reserve, Plan Vivo, and the Gold Standard. And the pie graph shows what approximately is their market share in terms of the amount of credits that they have produced over the lifetime of the organization. Verra is by far the largest. They have a lot of international projects in avoided conversion and REDD+. ACR is mostly a North American program that has improved forest management protocols. And the Climate Action Reserve is a large one based out of Los Angeles that does a lot of work with the compliance market as they manage the protocols for the California Air Resources Board. Before we move on, we can answer some questions if you'd like, Kristen.
Great. This goes back to the first section of slides, but Bruce was curious, was your market size slide US or the world?
So in the voluntary market slide with the market share, that would have been the entire voluntary market across the world, yes.
Okay, great. Lily was curious, how do landowners in South Carolina perceive and engage with carbon markets?
Yeah, great question. So it's been considered relatively new for a lot of landowners, and because of something that's so drastically new that does require a lot of changes, if you will, and relatively fragmented market, there has been a healthy amount of skepticism around the carbon market. And we as Clemson Extension have been doing the best we can to provide information around these markets, but there's so many projects being developed and so many different players in the market, it's still relatively new. I will say that I've spoken to a lot of people over the last couple of years that are very interested. So I think this will take off in the future, if you will. But right now we're still in that learning phase. And but I will say from a positive perspective that people are interested to learn more and to figure out alternative ways to manage and keep their forest land.
Great. Jeep asked, can you sell your land-based carbon credits annually?
So yes and no. I mean, technically we are sequestering carbon at a yearly basis, but typically the way these large scale projects would work is that every time there's a verification event, there would be the opportunity to sell those credits. So as those verifications happen every 5 to 6 years, then a new amount of credits would be issued. and then they could be sold on the open market. Now, this isn't to say there are other types of programs which I'm not really highlighting today, but there's examples of land yield or the family forest carbon program, which embed different payment structures for landowners, where you could, especially if you're a smaller landowner, could get paid at the yearly rate per se.
Excellent. We have a couple of more questions coming in. Matt Williams is interested on whether you envision a future scenario where these registries coalesce around VERA, ACR, or a few universal standard registries, standard rules, regulations. And then he's thinking a universal railroad gauge kind of adoption for easier understanding across industries and markets.
I think that's a great question and a great point, is that there is what you might call a lot of fragmentation in the market because there are so many different options and so many different protocols. I could see it go in two ways. The first one being there is already this push from what's called the international or the ICVCM, the International Council on Voluntary Carbon Market. And this council has come together to attempt to give credibility and transparency, integrity to the various protocols that are out there. So all of these entities have submitted their protocols for review from an international board, and this is going to give additional credibility to all of these protocols. What I will say though is that in a way, having different protocols is important for various land use types and different types of management. So we even see across the world that it's important to have different types of protocols and different flexibility within protocols to be able to manage the forests in a healthy way, first and foremost. So I think we are, again, coalescing around this idea of that international standardization, but not necessarily at the most nuanced levels within the protocols, with the goal, again, of maintaining healthy forests first and foremost.
Okay, great. And please know if you have any follow-up questions to Lucas's answers, please feel welcome to put those in the chat as well. And before we move on, we've got one more question from Andrew White. Let's see, is there any napkin math on what type of revenue South Carolina would expect to see under a few different implementation scenarios?
That's the $1 million question. And I think right now it is, frankly, it's too difficult to say. I think there's a lot of opportunity for it to be substitution revenue, if you will, substituting in place, potentially in terms of in places where there's high quality timber markets, if you will, it could be substitution revenue. But it is difficult to say that this is going to potentially replace or be greater than what we're seeing in other markets as of yet. We do expect carbon credit pricing to increase. You know, it was about $11, I think, in the voluntary market. We're starting to see that increase with specific projects related to specific offtake agreements, which I'll talk about a little bit more, which could see prices pushed closer to $30 to $50 a ton, and then potentially higher than $100 in coming years, depending on demand.
Excellent. Okay, I think that catches us up on the questions. So if you want to move forward.
Sounds good. All right, so the last section here is project development and carbon credit purchasing. So I've mentioned a lot of different entities that are involved in carbon project development, and it really comes down to a couple here, the main one being that carbon project developer. So typically a carbon project developer is a consultant that will take on the risk of a large-scale carbon project. They will work directly with the landowners, the registry, the buyers, and the third-party verifiers to actually implement these projects. So they'll work with the registry to register their products. Oftentimes, they will have already identified buyers before approaching landowners, or potentially they would have those connections with buyers to help the landowners feel more comfortable with being able to sell their credits, having that guaranteed due to the fact that they're taking the risk of that project, and then also be able to contract with those third-party verifiers to move the project through the process. And to that end, here's the general process that you'll see related to carbon project development. So in the very beginning, these project developers are going to determine if an area is feasible. They're going to determine that protocol to follow, whether it be improved forest management, voided conversion, afforestation. They'll inventory the forest, see how much carbon is out there already, and then they'll consult with that landowner regarding that new or preferred management going forward. After that point, they're going to quantify that baseline and project the future sequestration with new management. At that point, that landowner is probably going to have a pretty good idea of how many carbon credits that they can sell on their land over the life of the project based on the current on their new management, I should say. Next, they're going to then list that project with that registry. So they're going to take the protocol that they're using, list the project with the registry, and then it's going to go through a review process. That review process is going to start with that third-party verification. They're going to validate the project and verify the carbon stocks and the projected sequestration. So this involves a desk review and also a sample field plots review. After that whole process has taken place, the third party will then submit their review to the registry to make sure the credits are real, additional, permanent, and verified. And then ultimately those credits can be issued and traded on the offset market. So at that point, this process, initially developing a project, can take around 18 to 24 months with current timelines. Hopefully this will, the speed will increase in the coming years as this market becomes more developed. But I will say too, on the right, you see the arrow. Every 5 to 6 years, as I mentioned before, these projects do need to be verified so they can sell additional credits. So you're going to go back to step 4 and walk through 4 through 6 every 5 to 6 years to be able to sell more credits on these projects. So here's just an example of some of the carbon projects across the United States as defined by the amount of hectares per state. And then you have the ownership type. So government, individuals, NGOs, private companies, and tribal projects. And then the size of the bubble there is the amount of offsets issued. So you can see a lot of projects, especially in California and the Appalachians, are private companies, and then also some NGOs. So we have a couple of these examples in South Carolina. A lot of these were at the beginning of the compliance market related to early action projects in both improved forest management and avoided conversion. So this doesn't really represent all of the projects out there. As I mentioned before, there's programs like the Family Forest Carbon Program and Land Yield, which are catered towards those smaller landowners. So between 30 and 2,000 acres that would be able to enroll with those programs. And then they would be paid in a very different structure than I've discussed. Though behind the scenes, they're following very similar protocols to what we're discussing here today. So when we look at these different project types across the country, here are those primary management. As I mentioned before, that purple really sticks out. That's our no management or no commercial harvest. So that's going to be our avoided conversion type projects. And then you have uneven age, even age, and retention and selection harvest. All of these programs are typically like your improved forest management. And then we don't really have examples of afforestation here within this graph, but those are increasing. And as I mentioned before, there are multiple values associated with these carbon projects. And it's only been in recent years that we've seen that these projects are starting to capture all of the ecosystem services produced in forest ecosystems. So a lot of times we might see that there are trade-offs between carbon and ecosystem services. Nevertheless, we have seen a price premium in recent years that shows that projects that can actually quantify their ecosystem services are actually getting a higher benefit on the carbon pricing. So this is coming, and this is becoming really important, especially in the South, as we've done a lot of good around our carbon sequestration by maximizing forest growth, but we do continue to have opportunities to increase biodiversity and increase ecosystem services in many types of our ecosystems. So I want to give a little bit of an overview of how these credits work in the voluntary market, especially related to how are companies achieving their net zero and carbon neutrality goals. And if we look at it from a timeline perspective, these offset and carbon credits really work in tandem with value chain projects. There's been a lot of pushback in recent years that has said, well, if you're a company that's purchasing carbon credits, you must not be doing anything else for the environment. You just want to purchase credits and that's all you're doing. Research has shown that this is actually inaccurate, that a lot of companies that are purchasing carbon credits are also working in tandem to do value chain projects to reduce their emissions to achieve net zero goals or for consumer social responsibility. But there's a reason why in initial stages they would want to purchase carbon credits. If you're going to achieve carbon neutrality, the easiest way to do it would be to start with purchasing carbon credits. And you see that here in the 2020 on the left side of this graph. As you're identifying your emissions, companies are purchasing a lot of carbon credits so they can get to carbon neutrality very quickly. But as they increase their value chain projects, so that's the blue and yellow areas of the graph there, as they increase those projects, they're not going to need to purchase as many credits. So they're doing value chain projects as they identify their need and their ability to do that. But at the same time, we don't expect that carbon projects or carbon offset credits will ever go away. There will all be residual and scope 3 emissions that are required to be offset, and high quality carbon credits are going to be really important for those going into the future. So I just want to kind of finish up here with an example of how this market is moving forward. So the ability to actually move this market forward where we stand today is that we need a couple things. Landowners need guarantees of capital and the ability to sell credits so that they can feel confident moving forward in this market. And buyers need options that are low risk and high quality. And there's a couple ways we can do that. The Symbiosis Coalition is a great example of achieving both of these important factors. The Symbiosis Coalition has brought together a suite of companies, Google, Microsoft, Meta, and Salesforce, some of the largest names in this industry, to provide an advanced market commitment of up to 20 million tons of nature-based carbon removal credits. So they're guaranteeing that they're going to purchase up to 20 million credits, and then project developers can submit proposals to be a part of this purchasing. So once Symbiosis approves their proposal, then they will be able to guarantee that that capital will flow and that those credits will be sold. So that's guaranteed both towards the buyer and to the seller that these carbon projects will ultimately be funded and continue revenue generation over time. At the same time, the idea for buyers is, again, just like any type of market, is that they want to diversify their portfolio. So we've talked a lot about forestry credits today, but a lot of these companies, Microsoft is a great example, is they're diversifying their carbon credit portfolio. So they're purchasing nature-based removal credits. They're purchasing nature improved forest management credits. They're also purchasing biochar credits or other types of direct air capture credits that are removing carbon from the atmosphere. They even purchase agriculture credits as well. So diversifying the portfolio, doing value chain projects, but also just investing in nature-based solutions is the trend that we see from some of the largest players, and that we hope that that will play out in the future in hopes to jumpstart some of the climate goals that we have in South Carolina and then all across the world as well. So as just an overview, carbon markets continue to rapidly expand and evolve, and the management of carbon and ecosystem services is not going away in the near future. So what are we watching to see where this market goes? Well, a couple things are the impact of the core carbon principles labeling. And I mentioned that a little bit earlier in the question, where we talk about this international body who's identifying the standards that are actually creating real climate benefits. As the various protocols are labeled, this is going to help both buyers and sellers identify which protocols are the best and will garner the most revenue going forward. We're also seeing changing demand drivers. So because it is a voluntary market, that demand changes rapidly. So things like the Science-Based Target Initiative and then ESG and CSR requirements, as they change and evolve, this will help us be able to determine kind of that demand related to carbon credits. Also, the international trading of credits. So this is governed by the Paris Agreement. This was just announced in the last couple of months. So we're waiting to see how this evolves related to how international credit trading, but also airlines purchasing credits through a compliance market as well. Aggregating projects to focus on more as afforestation and reforestation. So again, that nature-based carbon removal project through Symbiosis is very much focused on tree planting. It's a little bit more it's a little bit easier to identify additionality in those types of projects. So there is become more of a focus on that type of project. And then lastly is the biodiversity credit market. So this is that opportunity to expand beyond carbon. There's been a lot of push globally to focus on biodiversity hotspots in terms of conservation and how can we not only sequester additional carbon, but how can we preserve and protect and then also enhance biodiversity that is so crucial for ecosystem services and for our life here on this planet. So that's developing, and we expect that that could potentially be a $2 billion market by 2030, with hoping to expand that by 2050 as well. With that, that's my presentation, but again, happy to take more questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Lucas. So if there's any other questions, please feel welcome to put them in the chat. This is an excellent level set on where carbon markets are today, knowing that this is a rapidly evolving market and there's a lot of changes in staying up to date. So we really appreciate you bringing us up to date with the latest and greatest information. And thank you for keeping your eye on the ball and being such a great resource for South Carolina. Let's see, it looks like we have another question here for Matt Williams. Lucas, the Carolinas was historically balanced between forests and grasslands. Trees obviously get the PR because it's easier to sell grasslands or to sell. Grasslands have some great capabilities with carbon sequestration too. Any push to introduce that into the option pool? It's a great question.
Yep. So there are some protocols out there related to grassland restoration, and specifically out of the Climate Action Reserve, if I'm not mistaken. And so yes, that's very much correct that they have the potential. It hasn't been yes, it hasn't been the easiest to sell, if you will, but the protocol does exist, and I do expect that it's a all solutions are important kind of thing when it comes to natural climate solutions. So it really will be a demand driver kind of thing. And it does come back to the idea that we want to make sure that we're planting trees where they should be planted as well. So grassland projects will be important in places where grasslands used to exist, and hopefully demand will reflect that.
Great. Sherry Fields asked, what are your thoughts on multiple small landowners developing a project for VCM?
Yeah, I think this is a really great point and a really important factor, especially for the Southeast moving forward. It's our average acreage size in South Carolina, and a lot of the Southeast is around 65 to 67 acres, which limits landowners from just immediately developing projects on their own with project developers or consultants. So as I mentioned a little bit, a couple programs do exist to help what's called aggregate these landowners into large projects, the Family Forest Carbon Program and land yield exist in this manner to be able to enroll smaller landowners. And then they do the heavy lifting of aggregating the project and providing the incentives there. So yes, it's coming, but I'd say that it's still small in nature right now. But hopefully that is the big focus of some of these developers and organizations like American Forest Foundation and Nature Conservancy to develop programs that benefit all types of forest landowners across the Southeast.
Excellent. Okay, well, I think that rounds out our questions. Again, Lucas, thank you so much for updating us on carbon markets and providing this level set of just, the basic foundation of this issue, and really appreciate, sharing your expertise on this. And I recognize that it's not the silver bullet I know many in South Carolina were hoping for, or throughout. But it, like you said, this is part of the revolution of where we are today, and being able to continue to work on this and figure this out. So I want to thank our team today as well, not only Lucas, but I want to thank our team of Emily Skaggs, who is our Director of Marketing and Events. And Emily, thank you for running tech on today's webinar, and appreciate your effort. Cynthia Davis, our Vice President of Sustainability, is on the call as well and has been helping put this webinar together for our team here. And also a big thank you to our CEO, Leslie Scarden, who's on the call as well. And so appreciate the Sustain SC team bringing together these monthly webinars that are top of mind to our members and our stakeholders of interest, which today's webinar came out of a lot of questions and a lot of interest to ask, would you do would you do a webinar on carbon markets? So for April, our next technical assistance webinar will be on circularity with Anna DeLage from the South Carolina Department of Commerce, and that will be on April 23rd. And as you can see on this slide, Sustain SC and our partners are busy at work maximizing the spring season with a series of events that we have coming forward. Hope you can join us, and you can always stay updated on what we're up to on our website, Sustain SC. And then also a great way to continue following the conversation on sustainability with the organization is to like, follow, tag, and share us on all these social media outlets on LinkedIn, Instagram, X. So please feel welcome to do that, and we would love to have you follow us, and also let us know your feedback on what other topics of mind that you have that you would like to see covered in these webinars. Because together we want to bridge commerce and conservation for a more sustainable South Carolina. So a big thank you again to our team and to Lucas and to each of you for making time out of a busy time of year to join us today, and look forward to continuing the conversation. So on this note, we'll go ahead and end the webinar and give you 3 more minutes to spare of your day, and hope everybody has a great spring. And if you have any follow-up questions, please reach out to me, Kristen Austin Gunter, the Vice President of Conservation for Sustain SC. And thank you for your time today.